Hello, everyone. Dr. Eames here. This time I'd like to talk to you about the organization's environment. Here's our learning objectives for this time. We'll talk about it in the most general way of what the organizational environment is composed of, the various elements, including the internal and external environments. We'll talk about change and complexity and how they lead to uncertainty, which really affects our decision making. We'll talk about Porter's five competitive forces. We'll analyze how organizations respond in a strategic way to the environment. We'll talk about organizational effectiveness, and also I'll talk about the very basics of organizational culture. We have two basic organizational environments, the internal environment and the external environment. Now, the external environment has two parts. It's composed of the task environment and the general environment. And we'll go through both of those with some examples also. Here's a good graphic that talks about the various environments that I just mentioned. As you can see, in the center is going to be our internal environment. And you can see that there are the two rings around the center, and that's the external environment, composed of the task environment and the general environment. Let's look at the internal environment first. This is really, like it says, the conditions and forces within an organization. So we have owners, boards of directors, possibly, employees, the physical work environment itself, and our organizational culture. So let's just start right there with owners at the top. And this could be so many things. So the first thing you want to know about the internal environment is that even in very similar companies, it's not going to necessarily be the same. And it will not always have the same elements. And this is because we have so many different varieties of management levels and company structure and so forth that we really find a huge amount of difference. So first of all, when it comes to owners, we could have a small company. The owners could be managers. In larger organizations and companies, the owners are typically the stockholders, and managers really are professional employees who manage the operations according to the strategy of the organization, which is laid out in the strategic plan. So we could have many types of owners, and this is really going to vary from a small business, a one-person business, a sole proprietorship. Well, a sole proprietorship, for instance, is not going to have a board of directors and it's not going to have partners or anything, but it could be a partnership of some type, and there are many types of those. Could be a corporation and so forth. Um, so this is really going to vary. And as well, we might have a private company that's family owned, or we could have I've mentioned, a corporation with publicly held stock, and the ownership is really in the hands of a great many different individuals. So we're going to see a lot of variation there in the ownership. Now, the board of directors, generally, we're going to find this in corporations or nonprofits. The board of directors will oversee general management and direction of the companies. They are elected by the stockholders in public companies and so forth. And these are the people that hire the CEO or president of most companies. If you have a board of directors, generally that's their purview, the hiring of the top executives and so forth. Now, employees are going to be just what we've talked about in the past. They're going to be exempt employees and they're going to be non-exempt. And these exempt employees are going to be the managerial talent that you have. They are exempt from the rules of the labor laws because they are salaried and they do not punch a time clock. And indeed, they have supervisory duties. But the non-exempt workers, they are subject to the labor laws, and they could be skilled or unskilled and so forth, and come in many types. But if they're paid an hourly wage, then they are the non-exempt workers. In other words, are not exempt from the provisions of the labor laws. So what we notice today when we look at our employees in a most general way is that we have a tremendous amount of increased diversity in our workforce. We have an increased use of temporary workers, which seems to be a trend into the future, and a very diminished role of labor unions at this point in time. Now, the physical work environment is just that. This includes your facilities, in other words, your building and its location, and all the internal conditions in that building or facility, the heating and cooling, the parking lot, and all of those things are part of the physical work environment. And so this would include how the facility is laid out and designed for workflow and so forth, and how the space that you have is allocated to various departments and things like that. So the physical work environment includes just about everything that you use. So that would include all the equipment to make or produce products, but also the office terminals and computers and the software that you use and all of those sorts of things. Um, the recent trend is that when it comes to the physical environment, we have more people telecommuting, certainly because of the pandemic. Um, Many organizations have adopted policies that are more flexible when it comes to work arrangements and the physical work environment itself. Um, Now, culture, we have to say, is going to be unique to every organization. And it doesn't matter if two organizations are in the same industry producing the same product, for instance. Um, they might be doing very similar types of things, but their culture will be very different and unique just to them because it is composed of different people who have different personalities and interactions and different dynamics going on. So we're going to see culture really is a collective expression of what the organization is and what people feel that it stands for. And really, it answers the question, what is it like to work in this place? And so we're going to have a lot of very unique sorts of culture, maybe sharing a lot of general sorts of characteristics, but indeed, each place is going to feel like it's completely different from another. Now, here, let's look at the external environment, starting with the general environment. Now, the general environment has 5 dimensions. This is what we see in most management textbooks. This includes the economic, the technological, the socio-cultural, the political legal, and the international dimensions. And each of these are not exclusive to themselves. In fact, there's a lot of overlap and so forth. But let's just take a look at these in a little more depth. The general environment, therefore, is very broad in its dimensions and the forces that create the overall context that does result in what your culture like and so forth. Let's just take another quick look at the previous slide to take a look at this. So here we have in the outer ring what I've been talking about with the dimensions. And as you can see, they are the things that we can not really affect as much directly. We have to react to them. And in fact, we have to be proactive so that we're not always behind the curve when it comes to something changed in the workplace, something changed in one of these dimensions. We don't want to be caught unaware. So we have to pay attention to current events. We have to plan accordingly and act proactively. So let's just look at these general dimensions. The economic dimension, anything affecting the overall health and vitality of the economic system. And generally, this is based on the country in which the organization is operating. But you're also subject to forces, economic forces in this case, that are happening anywhere in the world because the world is very much integrated today because of globalization. Now we have the technological dimension, and this is really the methods that we use to convert resources into products that have value added to them or providing a service of some type. And so there are so many changes today, of course, in our technological dimension that you really do have to be aware and following events, particularly in your industry, of things that might really have an impact on you. Now we have the social cultural dimension, and this is really about what do consumers think? What does the general public think? And so we're talking about customs and points of view and different changes in demographics in society and so forth in which you are operating. And you have to respond to these because the sociocultural dimension is the consumers who are out there and they are telling you what matters to them and what doesn't. Now, the political legal dimension is something you certainly have to react to. It means government. It means the laws and regulations that govern your relationship between business and government and the consumers and so forth. And it really does set the boundaries. And certainly you have to be aware of changes on the horizon or the current regulations and so forth that you have to answer to. And then, of course, the international dimension is really about the global scene. It's the extent to which you are involved in or affected by business in other countries. So there's a lot going on here in the general environment. The organization's boundaries, of course, are not really always clear or precise like they are in these graphics. And that's why I say there is a lot of overlap. Now, I've relisted all of the dimensions here for you, and I've included some links that are examples of things that happen in these various elements of the general environment. Go ahead and look at them on your own time, and you will see, I think, that there is some overlap and that something that happens in the economic sphere might also be related to the political, legal, or the international dimension and so forth. So we do see that huge amount of overlap. So here, let's have an example. Let's just take a look real quickly at McDonald's general environment and something that we can really relate to. So first, the economic dimension. Well, when people don't have money to spend, business really suffers. Weak economic growth is in the economic dimension, and that will affect not only McDonald's, but so many different businesses. If the economy is not growing and people are not doing well, it's always going to have an effect on business. And depending on the industry you're in and the position you have in that industry, will dictate how much that will affect you. For instance, if there's unemployment, like we have today with the pandemic, with millions of people out of work and in fact off the unemployment rolls, then it seriously affects how business is done. Also, inflation rates within your own marketplace, but also world inflation and things like the price of currency and so forth. When we look at the technological dimensions, we really would say anything new that would help us do business better, a better method or a procedure based on technology is something we would like. But then again, you always have to ask yourself as an organization, can we afford it or not? But the technological dimension does offer us many more efficient ways of doing things over time. And so we do see change happening in the technological dimension that we have to react to and plan for. Now, like I've said previously with the socio-cultural dimension, this can include so many things, but it's really about society at large that the organization is operating in. So if we have shifts in the types of people who are out there, for instance, the types of families, single families or dual income families do matter. And what they are thinking, what issues matter to them, and so forth is what business has to pay attention to. If you know that consumers want some certain thing, then business will respond to that want or need and try and provide it to them. On the other hand, if what is coming out of the sociocultural sphere or dimension is something that the society is frowning on, you also have to respond to that. And today, a good example of that, like it says here, would be concerns about health and nutrition. And we have seen, for instance, the fast food industry react to people's concerns about healthiness and healthy food and fresh food and so forth. Now, the political legal dimension is about government and laws and things that govern the parameters of your behavior as an organization. And so things like food standards get set, local zoning and so forth says where you can set up your business and so forth, how you respond to issues in climate caused by your reaction to laws and so forth, and so forth. And whether or not you have a active role interacting with government regulators, whether it's at the federal level or state level or local level, you still have to respond. And then, of course, international dimension. If you're selling any of your products or services abroad, then you are really influenced by the entire world's economic conditions. So you can see right there, we have a little bit of overlap. For instance, McDonald's, they've got restaurants in more than 115 different countries. So certainly things that are happening in each of those areas are going to affect how they do business in any given marketplace. And in fact, McDonald's actually, as it says here, gains the lion's share of their revenue from outside the United States and all the markets they serve rather than just the United States. So let's look at the task environment now, the other part of the external environment. Now, the task environment is something that we can influence directly. And in fact, this is where we do a lot of our operations and so forth. We have to deal with our competitors, our customers, our suppliers, strategic partners, and regulators. So when you look at your competitors, you're constantly looking to see where do we stand in comparison to them? Are we the market leader or are they the market leader? If they're the market leader, then you will want to say, what are they doing that possibly we aren't doing? And so you look to their best practices, try and find out those sorts of things and copy them wherever possible, whenever it's legal and ethical. Now, your customers certainly are those consumers who are willing and need to spend money to get something that you're providing to solve one of their wants and needs or a service or something like that. So these are, again, areas where we can have a direct influence. The same happens with your suppliers. These are partners, other companies that you work with that provide resources to you, other services that you need to do your business. Your strategic partners are just your allies, companies you've set up arrangements with to do things with. Often your suppliers become strategic partners, but not necessarily. A strategic partner doesn't necessarily have to provide you with something, but they might work with you in ways that enhance the operations or the profits for both of you. And then, of course, the regulators, as I've mentioned, they can set the rules, and you have to follow whatever the laws and policy and practices are in the area where you work. So here's an example of McDonald's general, task environment. As you can see, like we saw from the previous example, main competitors, you can see there are other operations within the fast food industry. Their customers are either business customers, really, or they're individual consumers. The suppliers are those companies that they have often made arrangements with, Coca-Cola, food processors, people who provide the bags and the packaging for their products and so forth. And then, of course, the strategic partners, you can see there's going to be some overlap here. But we do know that Walmart will occasionally have a McDonald's in one of their stores. Well, that's a strategic relationship that they've set up together. The same with Disney and in foreign markets and so forth for McDonald's. When it comes to the regulators, then here are some of the well-known federal agencies who tend to regulate many industries. The FDA, which is the Food and Drug Administration, certainly for McDonald's, that would come into play. The Securities and Exchange Commission comes into play because McDonald's does so much of their operations in foreign markets and so forth. And they have operations that cross state lines and things like that. So they're subject to certain rules. And then, of course, the Environmental Protection Agency. They are going to have rules that say this is what you can throw away, this is what your waste can consist of, this is how you handle, like, for instance, grease. You just can't release grease down the drain. It has to be gathered and disposed of in a proper manner. So the task environment, remember, is that area in the external environment where we can affect events, where when we look at that general environment, in our broad dimensions, that we have much more hard time trying to deal with and to, and indeed, satisfy. Let's switch gears here a little bit and let's talk about organizational culture, because it is an integral part of any environment. And in fact, it is your internal environment, how you act and what you think you are and what it's like to work in this place and so forth. So like it says here, our organizational culture, it's a set of values and beliefs and the way we behave and so forth that we share with everyone else who works in the same organization. And it tells us how we act, how we treat each other, and what we consider to be important. And certainly these are our espoused values, what we say we are. And these are the things that we put on our website. So consumers and people interested in working maybe for the organization can find out what do you stand for and try and get some information about you. Don't underestimate the power of organizational culture. A really strong culture shapes how well you do in the marketplace, how successful you'll be, whether you're the market leader or the market follower. And generally, it does help with a strong culture, your employees to buy into what you're doing and to be more productive overall. Well, here's a few more basics to talk about. Culture isn't something that just happens immediately. It takes a little time to develop, and it's extremely influenced by the founders of any given company or organization. Even when those founders are gone, their imprint generally lasts for a long time because they put their spin and their thinking on the policies and practices, so forth, and those become ingrained over time. And so that influence just doesn't go away right away. In fact, it grows and strengthens over time. And so this is something that tells you that culture is not something that's static. It's created and then we just forget about it. It's always the same. It is dynamic and it will change. And it can change quickly or it can change slowly. It just depends on a sequence of events. Today, almost all organizations that are doing business have a multicultural environment. Particularly in the United States, we've known for some decades now that we have become a multicultural nation. And multiculturalism is really that the idea is that our workforce, and indeed the society that produces that workforce, um, is admired in a lot of differences in values, beliefs, customs, and attitudes. And this interaction and this rich sort of trading back and forth of how we do things and how we think generally tells us that we're going to do a little better in the marketplace because we're bringing so much more, uh, so many more different perspectives to bear. We get better information flow, better understanding, and indeed we learn how to work together. So multiculturalism is really about diversity. And diversity exists whenever we start to have people who differ from one another in important areas like maybe age, gender, ethnicity, and all those sorts of things. Disabled, in fact, would be a category of diversity. Now, there are reasons for this increased diversity and this multiculturalism that is out there today. Um, the labor force has changed, the demographics of it. In other words, people in this particular instance are living longer. They're not retiring as soon or as quickly at earlier ages as they did in the past. And so we have an unusual situation we haven't experienced before, particularly in the United States and places like Japan and in Europe, where we could have as many as three generations of workers working side by side, doing similar work in a factory or in some enterprise of some type. Um, and so that is a change that has come upon us just in this last couple of generations or so. We also have increased awareness of that diversity. And we have a lot of research that tells us that this increased diversity improves our workforce, the quality of it, and our ability to solve problems and beat the competition, indeed. Um, we do have to react to legislation and legal action that is out there when it comes to diversity. Laws change over time. What protected group is covered by this law and so forth. There are differences in how the labor laws and regulations apply in the public sector sometimes, and there are also sometimes changes in how those laws affect nonprofit organizations and their workers. And then, of course, one of the biggest reasons that we have this increased diversity, particularly when it comes to multiculturalism, is the fact that the world has become very globalized. We are international in scope in so many of our operations. Here are some dimensions of diversity. Some of them are ones that we don't often think about. For instance, it's more than just ethnicity and religion. Gender, we have all sorts of issues with women not receiving equal pay with men for doing the same job. In other words, that glass ceiling. But the glass ceiling, the definition has been expanded over time, and now it includes minority members and women in particular, of minority groups. Age, like I mentioned, where you could have different generations working side by side. But it's also type of household, single family households, dual incomes, single incomes, things like that. And then, of course, disabled people. All of these things are just a few of the many, many dimensions of diversity that we could really talk about. Now, one thing that we do have to talk about out there when talking in general about organizations is this notion of environmental change and complexity. What this leads to whenever we have change, and indeed we live in a world of constant change, and many of our organizations become quite complex. Well, this leads to uncertainty. And it's because we live in a world of a continuous change. This uncertainty hampers our ability to make sound decisions. And indeed, it influences many decisions that managers have to make. In other words, we don't always have perfect information. We don't always know what's going to happen next in that general environment. For instance, we don't know always what new technology is coming along. We don't know what's going to happen economically around the world that will affect us and our operations over here. And so it is a driving force, this uncertainty, that really affects our decision making and our ability to make strong, appropriate decisions. Well, the environment affects organizations in the two ways I've mentioned, the constant change and the complexity. So when we look at the change itself, there are two things that we have to talk about. The degree to which changes in the environment are happening. So is it a case where in your organization you have changes every day that you have to react to, small ones, but maybe a highly competitive environment, so forth. So if you have constant change, you're going to be affected by different types of environmental conditions, but you're always going to have to be aware and respond quickly. On the other hand, you might be in a type of environment where change doesn't happen all the time. It's slow and things are kind of done the same way all the time. Um, the other force that affects change, of course, is the degree of homogeneity or the complexity of the environment itself. Does your industry involve a lot of complexity where there are a lot of departments and skills needed and a lot of different factors to consider all the time in your decision making? Or is it something that is fairly homogeneous where it's similar, it's stable all the time, things are very predictable and so forth? So these two things really do affect environmental change. And when we look at these two forces, the degree to which the change is occurring in the environment, and then whether or not it's homogeneous or it's complex, uh, result in that uncertainty that I've talked about. So let's just focus for a second on a grid that talks about the uncertainty. You can see the two continuums here, the degree of change. If we don't have too much change, then we say it's a fairly stable environment. If we have a lot of ongoing change, maybe daily or weekly or even monthly, that does seem fairly often, then we would say if you're more towards that end of the continuum of behavior, then it's a dynamic degree of change. The same thing can be applied to the degree of homogeneity. If we have a very complex environment, things are always happening, many moving parts, many different interacting departments and interdependencies and so forth, we would say, yeah, we have a complex environment. Companies that make lots of products and provide many services, you could almost certainly say they are complex when it comes to the type of environment they have. On the other hand, we have other industries and so forth where they're more simple. They're homogeneous in the sense that things don't change too much. For instance, the processing of sugarcane. It has been done the same way for decades and decades and decades and hasn't changed much over time. And it is not very complex. You can predict it. So therefore, it is simple. And when we say simple, we usually look at it and we mean it's stable, it's predictable. And so that's really what we want to look at. Um, let's define it this way. We look at the environment and we say if it's homogeneous, it's a simple environment, it has few elements, little segmentation. We don't divide up the marketplace too much. It's very predictable as far as consumers go. But if it's complex, there are lots of elements, lots of segmentation, lots of interaction. And again, remember, the key point here is that these factors in environmental change and complexity result in uncertainty. Now, here's a grid that looks at it a little bit differently. Um, this one tells us that it's going to give us a little more information about the degree of change and so forth. So, in that stable environment where things are still simple and predictable, well, here's where we could look at a few more details about it. You don't need to know a lot about how the components work. It's predictable. You can learn it quickly. If you look over in cell two, where degree of complexity is simple, but you have still a dynamic environment that's fairly complex, then there is that uncertainty that results in some unpredictability. Uh, the components are kind of similar, the parts that are interacting, but they are all continually changing. But they don't have as many components as you would see down here in cell four, where we have a complex and dynamic environment. So that is very unpredictable, lots of components. They are similar to each other and they're continually changing or adapting over time. And so you do need a little bit more knowledge of each of the components in order to be effective. And then when you look over to cell three here on the bottom left, this is a complex environment, but it's also stable. You can predict it. It's acted the same way for a long time, and therefore there's a predictability to it. There are a lot of components if it's complex, but they're not necessarily similar to one another, and they remain still because they are predictable, basically the same over time. But you do need that high need for knowledge of how the components work and so forth whenever you're talking about the complex environment. Now let's really switch gears here and let's talk about another thing that's really important when we look at the environment of any organization. We get Porter's 5 competitive forces. Now, Dr. Porter is at Harvard. He's become quite famous with his competitive forces, and they really do give us the categories where pretty much everything that's happening in business is happening in one of these 5 areas. And so first, let's just look at the threat of new entrants. Well, that is, how easy is it to get into your given industry? Does it take a little bit of money or does it take a whole lot of capital? Are there complex things that you have to know, knowledge and technology and so forth in order to get into the new entrants into that industry? Or is it just something that it doesn't take any knowledge and anybody could quickly join the industry and become a competitor? So threat of new entrants is the extent to and the ease with which competitors can enter your market. Now let's look at competitive rivalry right there in the center. This is simply the competition. Is the competition intense? Does it increase over time? Do other competitors fail and go out of business and new ones constantly come into the picture? You either have high competitive rivalry or you have low competitive rivalry or somewhere in between. So competitive rivalry really is also on a continuum of behavior. And so you have to react to that. Now, when we look at the threat of substitute products, this is really the extent to which a consumer can spend their money on something else other than your product or your service. And it's not necessarily in the same industry. For instance, you could decide that you need lunch and you might say, well, I think I'll have pizza today. But you could also go to a burger place or you could go to a Chinese buffet, or you could decide not to have lunch at all. You could decide to go home and cook your own dinner and not spend any money. So threat of substitute products is always there. You have to have a good value proposition, of course. This is where your marketing knowledge comes in and so forth. But there's always something else that people could spend their money on, and you have to be aware of that. And so put forth your best value at all times. The power of buyers is really how much knowledge and ability to make that decision to buy something, the threat of substitute products, do your consumers have, the buyers out there? How can they influence the market? Well, today, consumers really have a lot of power when it comes to spending their money. Think about it. They have all the information of the internet at their fingertips. They can find out through Google searches and so forth that what are the best products, what are the cheapest products, what are the best quality, what are the best sellers, what do the reviews say? And so because of this, buyers have a lot of power in today's consumer society, and the threat of substitute products for most industries is fairly high because of this. Remember, if you've had some marketing courses, that there was a time when suppliers manufacturers made any kind of product and didn't worry about whether or not they could sell it. It was a seller's market. Well, that has certainly changed in modern times with the rise of the internet and new technology. And that leads us to the power of suppliers here. The power of suppliers really are your partners, the people who you get inputs from that you need to get the work done of your organization. And so they can have a certain amount of power. If you need a certain input, for instance, a rare component, a rare metal, something that's in high demand, the price is going to be higher. And possibly the number of suppliers who can provide that will be lower. And so the power of suppliers in cases like that will be higher. They can set the price. On the other hand, if there's a lot of competition, a certain input is readily available and many suppliers are in the game, in the market, and so to speak, then maybe the power of suppliers is not as powerful and you can shop around a little more and you have a little more discretion. So you can see that these competitive forces are one way to really understand, if you ran an analysis, how well your organization is doing, where the real bottlenecks, where our real challenges lie. It is very similar to a SWOT analysis. Here's some substitute products, just a tiny smattering of logos and product names and so forth. And this is just a tiny number of all the companies, of course, that are out there. But it just gives you an idea of all the different products in so many different industries that really form the basis of our competitive rivalry. There is always some environmental turbulence out there. When we talk about uncertainty and change and adapting to it and responding to it, environmental turbulence is really the notion that we have unexpected changes. Things happen that we're not expecting. There are upheavals in the environment, so to speak, of your organization. And this does contribute to uncertainty. Some examples of environmental turbulence would be a war or a natural disaster, sudden economic shift. It can be in your task environment, or it could be in your general environment, or something unexpected happens in the internal environment of your company. Loss of infrastructure, for example. You lose your building, or a tornado comes and damages it in a big way, or loss of equipment, or your equipment becomes obsolete. You can't afford the new models or new types of technology that might replace it. Loss of resources, economic downturns that cause you to lose financial resources, or the competition for human resources is so intense that you can't afford to pay what's needed to lure away the best talent from your competitors. And of course, technology. Your technology becomes obsolete, or it just doesn't stand up to what the competition is doing. And then, of course, these other things can happen, and you can have loss of information, records, and things like that of how you're doing, and historical data that you really do need. Now, organizations are really challenged all the time to respond and adapt to their environment. And we have a couple definitions here really to talk about. A boundary spanner. Many organizations have boundary spanners. They are people who are part of the organization, but you don't see them much. This is because they are employees who spend much of their time in contact with others outside of the organization. For instance, a sales representative. You may not see them very frequently at all in the home office, yet they are a vital part of the organization. They are out working in the field in different districts or regions or turfs and so forth. Recruiters for our college, our boundary spanners. They don't have offices here at Westminster. They have an office in St. Louis or Kansas City or other appropriate places where they can recruit for us and so forth. So boundary spanners are just a specific type of employee, but they're still a vital part of an organization. So in order to deal with the uncertainty that's out there and all that change that's coming our direction all the time, we have to do what's called environmental scanning. Now, environmental scanning is this process where we actively monitor our external environment. Um, and we do this by observing what's going on, by getting on the internet, by following the latest news stories and things that affect our company or could have an effect. So, in other words, we have to keep up with current events. We have to keep up with our competitors and what they're doing. Um, Before the rise of the internet and so forth, we used to have an employee in many larger companies who were assigned, generally a clerical employee of some type, to do environmental scanning. And before the technology we have now, they would, and in fact, we still do this, but to a lesser extent. They would cut newspaper clippings. They would look through the current magazines that affect the industry or where articles about the organization might be mentioned or our competitors, and gather all that information and deliver it to some manager on a regular basis and so forth. When you go into the main building at Westminster Hall, there at the on top of the hill, when you come in the main doors, look to the left or right, you'll see bulletin boards. The stuff posted on there, there's often local articles from the Fulton Sun and other places, information that is about the college. Well, this was gathered as a result of environmental scanning. This is something all organizations, if they're smart, will do so that you are not caught flat footed, so that you are proactive in understanding what's going on in that external environment, and you can be proactive in your decision making and so forth. And then, of course, we use the information systems to really do much of the work in organizations that we have today. And it's a constant battle with keeping up with changes in technology, uh, making a decision whether or not you can afford to change to a new technology or whether it's worth the effort to do so. But we do use today, the main thing is database technology when it comes to information systems. And this allows us to store and retrieve information, to get reports, to mine down and get data and so forth, and to really do all the things that we need to do to gather the information to really help us do the best that we can when it comes to making decisions. Now, how do we adapt to the environment? Well, really, we use the different techniques and the ways we operate in those areas I've been talking about. So we manage our information, we try and have strategic responses. We can do things like mergers and so forth uh, that are really about joining with other companies, maybe buying another company and so forth. Uh, we can have flexibility in the way we design. The way we design and set up our departments really says a lot to how well we'll compete. If we have too much extras personnel, if we're not very efficient and we have more departments than we need, where we might have an opportunity to consolidate operations and so forth, we need to do those things in order to remain competitive and to remain flexible. So the way we lay out things, the way we design our processes really does matter in coping with all these different environmental influences. So sometimes we have direct influence, like we do with the task environment, and other times we have to respond, like social responsibility is demanded of us, and it comes out of that socio-economic sphere, the socio-cultural sphere, what we generally call these things. Now, there is a strategic response to the environment, and this is something we do want to remember. There are a lot of strategies out there that organizations use to respond to the changes they see, to the decisions they need to make. You always want to have a strategic response because a strategic response takes into account your goals and your mission and the things that you say that you're trying to accomplish in your 5 year plan and so forth. And so you could choose many different strategies. Here, though, what we're talking about is a very generalized way of looking at how do we respond strategically to change. Well, first of all, we are always monitoring, like I said, and following our strategic plan. We want to stay on track. So, monitoring means we're gathering information and feedback. And this helps us make the right decisions about some change that's come along. But we want to stay on track, of course, with what we say that we are and what we're doing. This allows us to become more efficient over time and allows us to be the most competitive that we can be. But really, as we gather information about our processes and the things that are important to us and how we act as an organization, we have three choices once we gather that info. If we look at that data and we've analyzed it and we say, well, this indicates everything's going okay. Therefore, the strategic response is let's maintain the status quo. Let's don't make any changes right now. We don't need to. Everything is going according to plan. But maybe the information says, oh, we've got a small bottleneck here, or we could improve our efficiency a little bit in this area on how these two departments work together. Some minor change. Well, then we alter the current strategy. And this is what happens a lot in most organizations. It's either we gather information weekly, daily, monthly, and all of that, and we're constantly, as managers at different levels of responsibility, deciding, do we maintain the status quo? Do we alter that current strategy? We like to avoid the third choice here, adopting a new strategy, because that means we're off track, that the information we've gathered and analyzed says, wow, things are not going right. And if we get to the point where our strategies and processes and things like that are not working for us, then we are not really being as efficient as we could be, and we might not be as effective as we want to be. And remember, we want to be effective because it means we reach our goals. So generally, we want to stick with maintaining the status quo, gathering the right kinds of information, or altering it in small ways, our strategies, our processes, our activities, something we're doing in order to respond to that environment. Now, we do have mergers, acquisitions, and alliances. This is another way to strategically respond to our environment. Now, the things I've talked about so far, maintaining the status quo or altering the strategy and so forth, those aren't mutually exclusive. In fact, any strategy that we choose is not considered the one best way to do things. We generally employ many strategies at the same time. And mergers, acquisitions, and alliances are different facets of a proactive strategy that interacts with the external world, just like we talked about with open systems. So a merger is when two or more uh, firms combine in some way. So we had Chrysler merging with with Mercedes-Benz, and we got Daimler-Benz forming Daimler Chrysler and so forth. We can have all sorts of mergers where two players join together and they realize that it's better to operate as one new company rather than as competitors. And often a merger is done in an amicable way, but sometimes they are not. An acquisition, for example, um, can be either friendly or not so friendly. And it's different than a merger because a merger is a mutually agreed upon activity. In the merger, for instance, money might change hands from one company to the other. Some managers will stay, some will go, some will keep their current titles, and some won't. There will be a realignment as two companies become one. But with an acquisition, a company is purchased. Um, so we get what we know as a hostile takeover when a firm is bought against its will. It doesn't want to be purchased. It doesn't want to sell out. It wants to remain independent. However, a company might come along if there was stock issued and they own a controlling share, they might be able to purchase enough stock to take over the company and therefore replace members on the board and so forth, and really be running the company. And the other party who originally owned the company might be minority holders, or they could be bought out completely. Um, but the firm that is taken over by an acquisition generally ceases to exist. It becomes absorbed into the other company and so forth. Sometimes it goes away completely. Other times it becomes an acting viable member of that family of the new company, of its different operations and so forth. Now, we also have alliances. Strategic alliances is generally what we call them, of all types. Basically, you form a venture with another company, and the idea is to create some synergy between the operations of both companies. Synergy means you can accomplish more together than you could by competing alone. So this happens all the time, and strategic alliances are quite popular today because it is very expensive in the real marketplace that exists now to acquire companies or to merge with another. Because in many industries, we've already seen this happen over the last few decades. And so we have a lot of very big players remaining, and the worth of these companies is quite high. And so sometimes in today's world, it's a little harder to do a merger or an acquisition, depending. And instead, we form these strategic alliances and partnerships with other organizations and so forth. An example would be that the global connection that airline companies enter into. They have alliances with different travel related businesses overseas or domestically. And the whole idea is they can better serve their customers and they can compete better in the marketplace by doing this. So an example of that particular one is American Airlines. They've got relationships with British Airlines, Hong Kong-based Cathay Pacific, Finnair, which is based in Finland, as well as dozens of different hotels, car rental agencies, cruise lines, and so forth around the world. So these things can be many different things. I'll give you another small example. You might be familiar with Cheez-Its, the little cheddar cheese crackers that you could buy. Well, Cheez-It partners with a small winemaker, an independent company, and they offer a combo product where you get a box of Cheez-Its and a bottle of wine, and you can buy them in a package deal. It benefits both companies, where Cheez-Its gets a little more notoriety, a little bit more coverage from the wine buyers, and the wine buyers certainly get to have some crackers with their wine and so forth. But it's as simple as it sounds. It is a great arrangement, and it is very characteristic of many of the sort of alliances that we see out there. Whatever you can think of and be creative about in an alliance, it can really result in some increased profit or efficiency of some type, is really what companies are trying to do today. Here we have some different approaches to being effective. Remember, effective is meeting our goals and accomplishing our mission. We have the systems resource approach, the internal processes approach, the goal approach, strategic constituencies approach, and the combined approach of any of the above. And that's the particular one there at the bottom. None of these approaches are mutually exclusive. So many organizations and companies of all types and different industries have a combination of these approaches acting at the same time. So let's just briefly talk about these. The systems resource approach shows that your efforts are devoted to acquiring the needed resources to get your work done. So your focus is on the inputs, the things coming in the door, the right materials, the best quality, the right timeliness, the right people, the right financial arrangements. All of those things are a systems resource approach. The internal processes approach deals with the things going on in that transformation process that we've talked about inside the organization. You're concentrating on making your transformation processes, how you produce a product or deliver a service, as efficient as possible. And so your approach there is on that transformation process, making it more efficient in particular. The goal approach, the emphasis obviously is on reaching goals. But the way we do it in the US society, our approach to business is we set smaller goals on the way to achieving our larger goals. And we measure our success and if we're able to meet the goals in a timely fashion, efficiently, and so forth. And so when you're looking at the goal approach, you're really saying the focus here is on our outputs. Are we achieving what we said we wanted to do? The goal approach ought to make us effective, and therefore we focus on the outputs. Are we producing what we said we were going to do? The strategic constituencies approach is we're emphasizing serving those groups of people, our segments, our market segments, who are interested in the products or services that we provide. And so we want to make them happy. And so we emphasize working with our stakeholder groups. Our stakeholders, of course, are any individual or company or group that has a stake or wants us to survive or do well because it will provide something to them that they want as well. So here, when we talk about strategic constituencies, we're focusing really on feedback and so forth. So the combined approach really just tells us that no one approach really does the job in today's market and in today's business climate. Smart firms are using contingency approach here. They are using whatever works. Now, here's our model of organizational effectiveness. We've seen this before. Things come in, we transform things, and things go out. This is the organization, and this is really looking at it from a systems perspective. We're gathering feedback all the time, and that's why we have the red arrows connecting everything. So as you can see here, we could really be using a variety of these different approaches as we try and provide services or products and so forth. So we could have the systems approach where we are acquiring resources that we need from the environment. And then the second approach here is the internal processes. We're combining them in an efficient and productive way. The goal approach is along the way, doing it efficiently. We're reaching our goals and moving forward with our planning and so forth. And the fourth way is in doing so, we are satisfying those strategic constituencies who have an interest in us being successful, who want our products or our services, who want us to succeed. It could include our strategic alliances with other partners and so forth. And then the combined approach means any or all of these that we're using uh, make it easier for us to do better into the future. So we might also see a situation where we are seeing that different approaches are used in different departments. Certainly, we would use a systems resource approach in the home office, where those knowledge workers who are putting out bids for materials coming in and comparing the service and so forth they would get from any given competitor, that's using a systems resource approach. And they're doing it there, right there in the home office. But the operations department is not necessarily doing that. They're telling the home office what they need, and then the home office is responding and using a systems resource approach to do the best things. But that operations department is saying, okay, we don't worry about that. That's the home office going to handle that for us. We've told them what we want and they're providing it. But we have to pay attention to how efficient we are, gathering the right information, making changes as we need them, or maintaining the status quo, and so forth. So really, it is a combined effort here. Okay, folks, that's all I wanted to talk about this time. I'll talk to you again soon.